The world of the early 13th century was in upheaval. From the windswept steppe of Mongolia to the fertile plains of Persia, an unstoppable force was moving westward. The name of that force was Genghis Khan, and by 1221 his empire was already stretching across vast distances, devouring cities, kingdoms, and armies with a speed that left chroniclers stunned. He was not just another conqueror. He was the culmination of centuries of nomadic warfare, uniting the fractured tribes of the steppe into a war machine that could outmaneuver, outfight, and outlast the greatest civilizations of the age. But in the shadow of this expansion, there arose an unlikely challenger, a young prince named Jalal al-Din, son of the Khwarezmian Shah, a dynasty that had once controlled the lands stretching from the Oxus River to the heart of Persia. The fateful meeting of these two figures, on the banks of the Indus River in 1221, would become one of the most dramatic and tragic encounters of medieval history. To understand how this clash came to pass, we must begin with the chain of events that set the Mongols and the Khwarezmian Empire on a collision course. When Genghis Khan's merchants arrived in the city of Otrar in 1218, they carried with them not armies, but goods, an offer of trade from the Khan, who had just subdued much of Central Asia. The Shah of Khwarezm, Ala al-Din Muhammad II, however, was wary of Mongol intentions. He mistrusted their sudden appearance at his borders and, in a fateful decision, allowed his governor to execute the merchants and seize their goods. It was an act of arrogance, perhaps born of the Shah's belief that the Mongols were little more than barbaric horsemen from the east. But to Genghis Khan, this was not just an insult, it was a declaration of war. The retaliation was swift and merciless. The Mongol armies descended upon Khwarezmian cities like a storm. Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench, centers of wealth, culture, and learning, fell one by one. Chroniclers describe the fall of these cities with grim detail: libraries burned, mosques desecrated, tens of thousands massacred. The Khwarezmian Shah fled before the onslaught, abandoning his people and retreating further and further until he found refuge on a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he eventually died in obscurity. But one of his sons refused to flee. Jalal al-Din, young, untested, and burning with defiance, chose instead to rally what remained of his father's scattered forces. Jalal al-Din was unlike his father in one crucial respect: he did not underestimate the Mongols. Where his father had relied on the strength of fortresses and large, unwieldy armies, Jalal understood that survival required flexibility, speed, and courage. He gathered soldiers, many of them fugitives from the devastation the Mongols had left behind, and forged them into a force that could fight back. In battle after battle, though often outnumbered, he began to show an uncanny ability to strike, retreat, and strike again. The Mongols, for all their might, suddenly faced an enemy who would not simply collapse. By 1221, Jalal al-Din had become the last beacon of resistance against Genghis Khan in the region. His forces numbered in the tens of thousands, though they were a patchwork of Persians, Turks, Kurds, and others who had flocked to his banner. With the Shah dead, Jalal was proclaimed Sultan, though his authority was fragile, dependent on victories that kept his men loyal. And victories he achieved, most notably at the Battle of Parwan, where his forces managed to inflict a rare defeat on a Mongol detachment. For the first time, the aura of Mongol invincibility wavered. Chroniclers tell us that Genghis Khan himself was deeply disturbed by this loss, not because it threatened the stability of his empire, but because it emboldened his enemies and proved that resistance was not entirely futile. It was in the aftermath of this battle that the stage was set for the clash at the Indus. Genghis Khan, determined to crush this last defiant prince, personally led a massive army in pursuit of Jalal al-Din. The young sultan had little choice but to retreat, driving his forces southward through the mountains of Afghanistan, then eastward toward the lands of the Punjab. His hope was to cross the great Indus River and find refuge in India, beyond the immediate reach of Mongol power. Along the way, his army grew weary, battered by the relentless pursuit of the Mongols, but also steeled by desperation. Jalal al-Din knew that if he faltered now, the Khwarezmian resistance would die with him. The Indus River itself loomed like a natural frontier, a boundary between worlds. For centuries it had marked the edge of empires, from the Achaemenids of Persia to the campaigns of Alexander the Great. By 1221, it once again became the stage for a confrontation between East and West, between nomadic conquerors and a beleaguered prince. Chroniclers describe the river at that time as wide, turbulent and unforgiving, its waters swollen with the spring melt from the Himalayas. To cross it under the best of conditions was perilous. To attempt it while pursued by the most fearsome army of the age bordered on madness. And yet, Jalal al-Din resolved to do just that. On the banks of the Indus, the two forces finally met. Genghis Khan had brought with him not only his veteran cavalry, but also his sons, generals, and trusted commanders. To the Mongols, this was not just another pursuit, it was a matter of pride, of ensuring that no enemy could boast of defying them. Jalal al-Din, meanwhile, had gathered the remnants of his forces for one last stand. He knew that defeat here meant death or capture, but he also understood that survival depended not on holding ground, but on buying time for his army and family to escape across the river. The battle that unfolded was ferocious. Jalal al-Din, mounted on his horse and clad in armor, personally led charges against the Mongols, rallying his men with cries of defiance. For a time, his forces held their own, using the natural terrain to their advantage and resisting the overwhelming tide of Mongol horse archers. Chroniclers describe him fighting with unmatched courage, cutting down enemies with his sword, his presence inspiring those around him to resist longer than anyone thought possible. Genghis Khan, watching from a hilltop, is said to have admired the young sultan's valor, even as his own troops pressed the assault. But courage alone could not turn the tide. The Mongols, with their unmatched discipline and tactical brilliance, gradually encircled Jalal al-Din's army. One by one his men were cut down or driven into the river, where many drowned in the swift current. Still, Jalal refused to surrender. In a final, desperate act, he spurred his horse toward the riverbank and, in full view of Genghis Khan and his assembled commanders, leapt into the Indus with his horse. Chroniclers describe the scene as almost legendary, the young sultan plunging into the raging waters, his horse swimming against the current, arrows whistling around him. Against all odds, he reached the far shore and climbed out, soaked, battered, but alive. Genghis Khan, watching from the opposite bank, is said to have remarked to his sons, "A father should have a son as brave as this." It was not mere admiration, but recognition of the spirit that even the greatest conqueror could not extinguish. Jalal al-Din had lost the battle, but in surviving, he became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, defiance could endure. The clash at the Indus did not alter the course of Mongol expansion. The Khwarezmian Empire lay in ruins, and Jalal al-Din would spend the rest of his life wandering, struggling to rebuild his fortunes, and ultimately meeting his end at the hands of assassins. Yet in that single moment, on the banks of the Indus, he etched his name into history as the man who dared to defy Genghis Khan and lived to tell the tale. To appreciate the magnitude of what happened at the Indus, it is essential to step back and examine the forces that converged on that riverbank. Genghis Khan did not simply appear as an unstoppable conqueror by chance. His rise was the product of decades of struggle, alliances, betrayals, and a revolutionary reorganization of warfare. The Mongol war machine that pursued Jalal al-Din across Central Asia was unlike anything the world had seen, a living engine of conquest that combined speed, intelligence, and brutality in perfect measure. The Mongols were, at their core, a people shaped by the harsh realities of the steppe. Their lives revolved around mobility, herding, and survival in an unforgiving environment. This upbringing forged warriors who were expert horsemen from childhood, skilled in archery, and able to endure extremes of hunger and hardship. But what Genghis Khan did was take these qualities and mold them into something unprecedented. He united the warring tribes under a single banner, erasing clan divisions and instituting a system of meritocracy that rewarded loyalty and talent over birthright. Generals who served him were chosen not because of noble lineage, but because they had proven themselves in battle or shown extraordinary ability. This created a corps of commanders fiercely dedicated to their Khan, bound not by family ties, but by personal loyalty and shared ambition. Central to the Mongol system was intelligence gathering. Wherever they went, Mongol forces employed spies, scouts, and informants to understand the terrain, the strength of enemy forces, and the weaknesses of opposing leaders. When they pursued Jalal al-Din, they already knew his numbers, his route of retreat, and even the morale of his men. This constant stream of information gave the Mongols the ability to predict, adapt, and strike with uncanny precision. But it was not only organization and intelligence. The tactics of the Mongols were revolutionary. They perfected the art of the feigned retreat, pretending to flee in panic, drawing enemies out of formation, and then turning suddenly to encircle them. Their horse archers could loose arrows with deadly accuracy, while riding at full gallop, raining destruction on enemies from a distance before closing in for the kill. Unlike the large, slow-moving armies of their opponents, Mongol forces operated in units that were fast, disciplined, and capable of independent action. Orders could be transmitted across vast distances through a relay of signals, flags, and horns, ensuring coordination even in the chaos of battle. Against this machine, Jalal al-Din had only fragments of an empire in ruins, and yet he refused to bow. His defiance was not merely military, it was symbolic. In him, many saw a chance for survival, a leader who might yet turn the tide. For the Islamic world, humiliated by the Shah's flight and the collapse of Khwarazm, Jalal represented a sliver of hope. Chroniclers from later centuries would look back on his stand at the Indus not simply as a battle, but as the embodiment of resistance itself. Yet the tragedy of Jalal al-Din lay in the isolation of his cause. Though his name would become legendary, in his own time he stood alone. The caliph in Baghdad offered him no aid. The rulers of surrounding lands, fearful of the Mongols, hesitated to commit themselves. Many preferred silence or submission rather than risk annihilation. In this sense, Jalal al-Din's desperate retreat toward the Indus was not only a military maneuver, it was the march of a man abandoned by the very world he sought to defend. The Mongols, meanwhile, understood this isolation. They pursued him relentlessly, not merely to defeat him in battle, but to break the last symbol of resistance. Genghis Khan himself had already reduced empires larger and wealthier than Khwarazm, but he knew that as long as one figure remained to rally the scattered survivors, the conquest would remain incomplete. Jalal al-Din had to be confronted personally. That is why the Khan, despite delegating campaigns to his generals elsewhere, rode in pursuit of the young sultan. This was not simply strategy, it was personal vindication. As the two forces drew closer to the Indus, the geography itself played a decisive role. The rugged mountains of Afghanistan had already tested Jalal's forces, forcing them to fight rearguard actions and endure ambushes. Now, as they entered the Punjab, the land opened up into broad plains, perfect for Mongol cavalry maneuvers. Jalal's only salvation lay in crossing the Indus and placing the river between himself and the horde. The Indus was no ordinary boundary. It was a formidable natural barrier, wide and treacherous, offering both peril and promise. For centuries, it had marked the gateway into India, a land rich with kingdoms but distant from the politics of Central Asia. Jalal believed that if he could reach the far bank, he might find refuge, perhaps even allies willing to resist the Mongols. The Mongols, however, understood that they had to corner him before he crossed. Thus, the stage was set for a battle that was both inevitable and symbolic. Genghis Khan standing at the head of an empire still expanding, and Jalal al-Din leading the remnants of one destroyed would meet face to face. Chroniclers remind us that Genghis Khan rarely expressed open admiration for enemies, yet the very fact that he pursued Jalal personally speaks to the threat and respect he recognized in him. As the sun rose over the banks of the Indus in 1221, the air must have been thick with tension. Jalal's men, weary from weeks of retreat, knew that they faced overwhelming odds. Many of them had already lost families, cities, and homes to the Mongol tide. To them, this final stand was less about victory and more about honor, survival, and the slim hope of escape. Across the field, the Mongol warriors were confident, disciplined, and eager. They had crushed countless armies before, and to them, this was merely the final act of a campaign that had already broken an empire. Yet even in the face of this disparity, Jalal al-Din inspired his men with a defiance that bordered on legend. Chroniclers recount that he rode among his troops, urging them to fight with the courage of lions, to make the Mongols pay dearly for every inch of ground. He reminded them that they fought not only for themselves, but for their families, their faith, and the memory of a shattered empire. His words ignited sparks of resolve among men who had little left to lose. The battle began with a thunder of hooves, the Mongol horse archers advancing in fluid waves, loosing volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. Jalal's men, though outnumbered, responded with charges of their own, closing the distance in fierce clashes of sword and spear. For hours, the two sides contested the ground near the riverbank, the noise of combat mingling with the roar of the Indus. From his vantage point, Genghis Khan observed everything. Chroniclers suggest that he was impressed not only by Jalal's bravery, but also by his tactical instincts. The young sultan managed to rally his men repeatedly, countering Mongol maneuvers and resisting encirclement longer than anyone expected. But slowly, inevitably, the Mongols tightened their grip. Their feigned retreats lured Jalal's men into vulnerable positions. Their relentless arrows thinned the ranks. Their sheer discipline began to wear down resistance. It was in this crucible that Jalal made his fateful decision. Realizing that the battle was lost, he chose not to surrender, but to escape. With a small band of loyal warriors, he cut a path toward the riverbank. Chroniclers paint a vivid picture of his leap into the Indus, the horse plunging into the torrent, the Sultan's armor glinting in the sunlight, arrows trailing behind him like dark streaks across the sky. On the far shore, drenched but alive, he turned once to look back, as if to etch the memory of that battlefield into his soul. Genghis Khan's words at that moment, admiring Jalal's courage, have echoed through the centuries. It was rare for the conqueror to praise an enemy, rarer still to do so in front of his sons. Yet in Jalal al-Din, he recognized the very qualities that had made his own rise possible: defiance, resilience, and unyielding will. The image of Jalal al-Din leaping into the raging waters of the Indus and surviving the Mongol onslaught became more than a dramatic episode in a single campaign. It became a turning point in how history remembered him. For his followers who managed to escape, the sight of their leader defying death against impossible odds was a moment of pride that burned brighter than the sorrow of defeat. For the Mongols, it was a reminder that even the mightiest empire could not extinguish every spark of resistance. And for Genghis Khan himself, it was a demonstration of courage that transcended enmity, inspiring words of reluctant admiration. But the story did not end on that riverbank. Jalal al-Din's leap into the Indus was not just an act of desperation. It was the beginning of another chapter in his struggle for survival and relevance. When Jalal reached the far shore of the Indus, he entered the lands that had for centuries been the frontier between Central Asian conquerors and the Indian subcontinent. India, fragmented into regional kingdoms, was not untouched by war, but it was outside the immediate reach of Mongol dominion in 1221. Jalal hoped that here, beyond the river, he could find refuge, perhaps allies willing to resist the Mongols, and the chance to rebuild a base of power. With the remnants of his loyal followers, including his family, he began to move through the Punjab, seeking both shelter and opportunity. But India was not waiting to embrace him as a savior. The rulers of the region were wary of Jalal and his wandering army. To them he was a foreign prince whose father's empire had collapsed, leading a band of desperate soldiers who could as easily become invaders as allies. Jalal, with his fiery defiance and restless ambition, inspired admiration but also fear. Chroniclers record that he quickly found himself entangled in conflict with local rulers, not because of Mongol pursuit — by then Genghis had halted his chase at the river — but because Jalal's very presence was destabilizing. His men needed supplies, his horses needed grazing, and his ambitions required territory. In one notable episode, Jalal clashed with the forces of the Delhi Sultanate, the rising power in northern India. The Delhi Sultan, Iltutmish, had watched the Mongol advance from afar with great concern, understanding the threat that this new force posed to all neighboring realms. Jalal al-Din, approaching Delhi, hoped to secure asylum and perhaps recognition as an ally. But Iltutmish, calculating carefully, refused. To shelter Jalal would mean inviting the wrath of the Mongols, who might see such protection as defiance. And so the Sultan of Delhi turned him away. Isolated once more, Jalal was forced to move through India without strong allies, relying only on his charisma, courage, and the loyalty of his dwindling forces. Yet even in exile, Jalal al-Din did not surrender to despair. He continued to fight, launching raids, skirmishes, and small campaigns, seeking to carve out territory that might serve as the foundation for a revived Khwarezmian state. His life became a cycle of battle and retreat, victory and loss, never finding the secure base he so desperately needed. In this, his story mirrored the broader tragedy of his people. The Khwarezmian Empire, once stretching across Persia and Central Asia, had been obliterated in a matter of years, reduced to scattered refugees and wandering war bands. Jalal embodied their fate, unconquered in spirit, but unable to reclaim what had been lost. The Mongols, meanwhile, did not pursue him into India. Genghis Khan, satisfied with his victory at the Indus and unwilling to overextend his forces into unfamiliar and difficult terrain, turned back. His empire had already achieved its objective, the destruction of Khwarezm and the demonstration of Mongol power to the Islamic world. The pursuit of Jalal beyond the river would have been costly and unnecessary, and so the Mongol horde withdrew, leaving Jalal alive but cut off, a fugitive who carried with him both the pride of survival and the burden of exile. What makes Jalal al-Din's survival so significant is not the military consequences, which were limited, but the symbolic weight it carried. His defiance became the stuff of legend. Later chroniclers, particularly those writing in the Islamic world, elevated him as the hero who had resisted the Mongols when all others had fallen. His leap into the Indus was described in poetic terms, transformed into a metaphor for resistance against overwhelming force. In a time when fear of the Mongols spread like a shadow across Asia, Jalal became a reminder that even the greatest conqueror could be defied, if only for a moment. Yet the reality of Jalal's later years was far less glorious. His campaigns in India were marked by constant struggle and uncertainty. He lacked the resources, manpower, and political legitimacy to build lasting power. Many local rulers viewed him as a temporary problem, a displaced prince with ambitions that threatened their own stability. His army, though loyal, was constantly tested by hunger, disease, and desertion. Without a secure base, Jalal was forced to wander, moving from one conflict to the next. In time, he left India and attempted to re-establish himself in Persia, the homeland of his family. But the Mongols were never far away, and the fractured politics of the region made his task nearly impossible. Rivals, allies who betrayed him, and the relentless pressure of survival shaped the final years of his life. In 1231, a decade after his dramatic leap into the Indus, Jalal al-Din was killed, not by the Mongols but by Kurdish assassins. His death was quiet compared to the thunder of his youth, his legacy left to chroniclers, and storytellers who would remember him as the Sultan who had dared to stand against Genghis Khan. And so the clash at the Indus stands as both the climax and the beginning of his legend. In that moment, the Mongol Empire was at its height, crushing everything in its path, and yet one man against all odds refused to bow. His survival carried no lasting strategic victory, but it carved into history an enduring story of defiance. Jalal al-Din's courage on the banks of the Indus was remembered even by his enemies, and admired by the very conqueror who sought his destruction. It was proof that even the most unstoppable of forces could be met with resistance, however fleeting. For the Mongols, the battle reinforced their dominance. The Khwarezmian Empire was gone, and the Islamic world lay vulnerable. Within a few years, Mongol armies would march further west, reaching into the Caucasus and threatening even the heartlands of the Middle East. For the Islamic world, the fall of Khwarezm and the flight of its last sultan was a sobering reminder of how fragile kingdoms could be in the face of nomadic conquest. Yet the memory of Jalal al-Din softened that despair, offering a story of pride amid devastation. The Indus itself remained unchanged, a silent witness to the clash of empires. Its waters had carried the horses of Alexander the Great centuries earlier, and now they bore witness to the leap of Jalal al-Din. History often records battles in terms of winners and losers, but at the Indus, something more enduring was born. A story that transcended the immediate outcome, carrying with it the echoes of bravery, defiance, and the eternal human will to resist. From the Mongol perspective, the confrontation at the Indus was not a turning point of strategy, nor a major obstacle in their expansion. In their vast campaigns, it was a footnote, a pursuit of a fleeing enemy who had already been defeated in the greater scheme of things. Yet the fact that Genghis Khan himself oversaw this chase and bore witness to Jalal al-Din's defiance speaks volumes about how the Mongols viewed this young sultan. For all their ruthlessness, the Mongols were pragmatic. They respected strength, even in their enemies, and despised cowardice above all else. Jalal al-Din, in their eyes, had shown the qualities of a warrior worthy of memory. For Genghis Khan, the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire had been one of the most punishing yet decisive episodes of his reign. The slaughter of his merchants at Otrar had ignited a war of vengeance, but the results went far beyond retribution. By the time Jalal al-Din leapt into the Indus, the empire of Khwarezm had been utterly annihilated. Its cities were reduced to rubble, its population scattered, its ruler dead in exile. The Mongols had achieved not only military victory, but also psychological domination. The Islamic world, which had regarded the Khwarezmian state as a formidable bulwark, had been shown how quickly even the most powerful kingdoms could collapse when confronted with the discipline and ferocity of the steppe horsemen. This campaign also had long-lasting consequences for the Mongol Empire itself. It stretched their reach further than ever before, bringing them into contact with lands and peoples that would shape the next phase of their conquests. From the fertile fields of Transoxiana to the deserts of Persia and the mountains of Afghanistan, the Mongols had demonstrated their ability to adapt to any terrain, to besiege the largest cities, and to outmaneuver armies many times their size. By 1221, Genghis Khan had established his name not only as a ruler of the steppe, but as a conqueror of civilizations. Yet within the Mongol ranks, the pursuit of Jalal al-Din carried a certain symbolic weight. This was not a man who had hidden behind walls or fled in disguise as his father had done. Jalal fought, retreated, fought again, and finally stood against them at the edge of the world he knew. To the Mongols, who prized courage and loyalty above all else, this earned him a peculiar respect. The Khan's remark, admiring Jalal's bravery, was not an empty gesture. It reflected the Mongol worldview that even in defeat, a warrior's worth could be recognized. For the Islamic world, however, the destruction of Khwarezm was nothing short of catastrophic. The great cities that had once flourished with trade, scholarship, and culture were left as smoldering ruins. Bukhara, once a jewel of Islamic learning, was stripped of its treasures. Samarkand, a city of artisans and scholars, was depopulated. Urgench, the Shah's glittering capital, was drowned in fire and blood, its population massacred in one of the most brutal episodes of Mongol conquest. The loss was not merely political, it was cultural, intellectual, and spiritual. The shock reverberated across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cairo, leaving rulers trembling at the prospect of the Mongols turning their gaze further west. It was into this void that the story of Jalal al-Din carried meaning. While his father was remembered for cowardice, Jalal became a counterpoint, a figure who had resisted to the very end. Chroniclers who wrote of the Mongol devastation often inserted Jalal's story as a reminder that not all had surrendered, that one man had embodied the defiance of an empire. His leap into the Indus became legend, retold in bazaars, courts, and chronicles, a symbol that even in the darkest hour, resistance was possible. Meanwhile, the Mongols themselves moved on to new campaigns. The defeat of Khwarezm opened the path to the Caucasus, where Mongol armies would strike deep into Georgian and Armenian lands and even reach the steppes of southern Russia. This westward expansion, made possible by the crushing of Jalal's homeland, laid the groundwork for future generations of Mongol incursions into Europe and the Middle East. The Indus for Genghis Khan marked a boundary he chose not to cross, not out of weakness but out of strategy. The subcontinent, with its dense populations and challenging climate, was not yet his target. Instead, the West called, and with Khwarezm destroyed, the gates lay open. For those who survived the Mongol devastation, the contrast between Genghis Khan and Jalal al-Din could not have been starker. One represented irresistible force, the will of heaven sweeping aside kingdoms like sand. The other represented stubborn defiance, the refusal to submit even when surrounded by ruin. It is perhaps for this reason that Jalal's story endured. In him, people saw not only a leader, but a reflection of their own struggle to survive, to resist, and to hold on to dignity when all else was lost. And yet, the tragedy of Jalal al-Din also lay in what might have been. Had he found greater support from neighboring rulers, had the caliph in Baghdad rallied to his cause, had the Delhi Sultan chosen to aid him rather than turn him away, perhaps a coalition might have emerged that could have checked Mongol expansion. But such unity was absent. The rulers of the Islamic world were divided, often more concerned with their own rivalries than with the larger threat looming from the steppe. Jalal was left to carry the banner of resistance alone, and while his personal valor was immortalized, it could not halt the tide of history. The Mongols, for their part, did not fear resistance from the Islamic world after Khwarezm. They had seen firsthand how quickly empires could crumble under their assault. They respected Jalal's bravery, but they did not consider him a serious threat once he had fled beyond the Indus. To them, his survival was a curiosity, not a danger. Their eyes were already fixed on new horizons, new cities to conquer, and new realms to bring under the shadow of their empire. In the end, the clash at the Indus symbolized the meeting of two very different fates. For the Mongols, it was a victory that reinforced their reputation as invincible. For Jalal al-Din, it was a defeat that nonetheless secured his immortality in history. His courage did not save his empire, but it saved his name. And in the centuries that followed, when the Mongols themselves faded into memory, Jalal's leap into the Indus continued to be told as a story of hope amid devastation. The river itself became the silent witness to this encounter, as it had been to so many before. Alexander had crossed it in triumph centuries earlier, carrying Hellenistic influence into India. Now it bore witness to another warrior, not in conquest but in defiance. The Indus was not conquered that day. It was defied, just as Genghis Khan was defied, and in that defiance lay the enduring power of Jalal al-Din's story. The leap into the Indus secured Jalal al-Din something greater than a temporary escape. It secured him a place in memory. His survival after the catastrophic collapse of his father Ejur's empire offered a rare narrative thread in a time dominated by Mongol victories. Chroniclers, poets, and later historians clung to his story as a counterweight to the despair that swept across the Islamic world. But while memory granted him a heroic place, the reality of his life after the Indus was far less romantic. The decade following his escape was defined by struggle. Jalal al-Din moved from one land to another, never able to rest, never able to rebuild what had been lost. In India, as he sought to regroup, he found little welcome. The Delhi Sultanate, fearful of Mongol reprisal, closed its gates to him. Local rulers, uncertain of his intentions, resisted his presence. To many he was not a savior but a destabilizing force, a fugitive prince whose army might plunder as readily as defend. And so, Jalal's survival became a double-edged sword. He lived, but in living he carried with him an aura of danger that made allies scarce. Still he fought. In the Punjab, in the rugged regions near the Himalayas, Jalal continued to wage small campaigns. His army, though depleted, remained fiercely loyal. These men, many of them displaced refugees and remnants of Khwarezm's shattered legions, clung to him as the last hope of restoring their honor. And Jalal did not disappoint them in spirit. He rode at their head, fought in the thick of battle, and inspired them with his defiance. But inspiration could not overcome the grim arithmetic of power. Without a strong base, without the wealth of cities or the backing of states, his campaigns were brief sparks in the darkness, flaring brightly but fading quickly. Eventually, Jalal turned his gaze back toward Persia. His father's lands lay in ruins, but Persia had always been the heart of Khwarezmian power, and he hoped that there, among the mountains and deserts, he might find the chance to revive his fortunes. The journey westward, however, brought him into a fractured world. Persia was caught between the lingering shadow of Mongol devastation and the ambitions of local powers eager to seize what remained. Jalal arrived as both a claimant and an outsider, respected for his courage but distrusted for his ambitions. Throughout these years, the Mongols watched but did not pursue him with the same vigor as before. Genghis Khan had moved his focus elsewhere, turning his armies toward the Caucasus and beyond. The empire's attention shifted westward, probing into Georgia, Armenia, and eventually the steppes of southern Russia. For the Mongols, Jalal was no longer a primary threat. They had already accomplished their goal, the eradication of Khwarezm. His survival was an irritation, not a danger, and yet precisely because he was no longer hunted with the same ferocity, Jalal found the space to maneuver, to wage his small wars, to carve out a fragile existence on the edges of chaos. What stands out in this period is how Jalal al-Din became a figure larger than his actual power. Chroniclers elevated him as a symbol of resistance, often magnifying his deeds and battles beyond their immediate importance. To them, Jalal embodied the qualities that his father had lacked: courage, determination, and loyalty to his people. He was not remembered as the man who lost an empire, but as the man who refused to let it die quietly. In this way, Jalal became a mirror for the aspirations of those who survived Mongol conquest. His victories, however small, were seized upon as signs that the Mongols could be resisted, that defiance had not been extinguished, but the reality of his life remained precarious. Jalal al-Din spent his years in Persia moving from conflict to conflict, trying to rally forces, attempting to reassert his claim to power. He fought Kurds, Persians, and Turks, as much a wanderer as a ruler. His men followed him with loyalty, but exhaustion weighed heavily. Without a stable base, without recognition from larger powers, his ambitions slowly ground against the hard stone of reality. By the end of the 1220s, Jalal's story was drawing to a close. In 1231, he was killed by Kurdish tribesmen in the mountains. His life ended not by the Mongols who had pursued him so relentlessly, but by opportunists who saw in his weakened state a chance to eliminate a restless neighbor. It was a quiet death compared to the thunder of his youth, almost anticlimactic after the heroics at the Indus. Yet in dying, Jalal al-Din became something more than a wandering sultan. He became legend. His enemies might have killed the man, but the memory of his defiance remained alive. For the Mongols, his death was of little consequence. By then, the empire had moved far beyond Khwarezm, stretching toward the Middle East, where Mongol armies would soon confront the Abbasid Caliphate and other powers. The Indus campaign was already receding into the past, remembered only as one chapter in the vast saga of Mongol expansion. But for the Islamic world, Jalal's leap into the Indus and his later struggles remained points of inspiration, woven into the narrative of endurance in the face of catastrophe. In later centuries, poets and chroniclers cast him as the archetype of the warrior who refuses to yield. His story was retold not only as history, but as moral instruction, an example of courage when all seemed lost. Even Genghis Khan's words, praising Jalal's bravery, were preserved as part of the legend, transforming the young sultan into a hero recognized by friend and foe alike. His leap into the river was described in almost mythic terms, as though it transcended human ability, an act of defiance so pure that it entered the realm of folklore. The power of this memory reveals something essential about the clash at the Indus. The battle itself did not alter the course of Mongol expansion, nor did it preserve the Khwarezmian state. Strategically, it was a defeat. Yet it mattered profoundly because of what it represented: the unwillingness to submit, the possibility of defiance, the reminder that even the greatest conqueror could not erase every trace of resistance. Jalal's story endured because it offered meaning in the face of overwhelming loss. The Mongol Empire would continue to grow, sweeping deeper into the Middle East, eventually reaching Baghdad in 1258 and bringing down the Abbasid Caliphate. But amid these sweeping conquests, the tale of the Indus lingered. It was a story of one man standing against a tidal wave, and though he was swept aside, he refused to drown quietly. History often remembers conquerors, but in Jalal al-Din, history remembered the courage of the defeated. The story of Genghis Khan and Jalal al-Din at the Indus is more than a battle. It is a moment suspended in history, where myth, memory, and reality intersect. To understand its weight, one must step back and view it not as an isolated encounter, but as a reflection of a world in transition. On one side stood Genghis Khan, the embodiment of an unstoppable new order, a leader whose vision was not confined to steppes and pastures, but stretched across continents. On the other stood Jalal al-Din, the last heir of a collapsing dynasty, carrying the burden of a lost empire, yet refusing to bow. Their clash at the Indus was the collision of inevitability with defiance, of rising empire against fading kingdom, of destiny against choice. For Genghis Khan, the Indus campaign was but a single line in a vast chronicle. His empire was expanding relentlessly, his generals probing into the Caucasus, Russia, and soon the Middle East. The Mongol war machine was already reshaping Eurasia, leaving behind a trail of destruction and integration, of cities razed, but also trade routes secured. The pursuit of Jalal al-Din was not a campaign born of necessity, but of principle. To Genghis, no enemy, however small, should be allowed to survive unchecked. It was this ruthless consistency that forged the Mongols into the most formidable force of their age. Yet, for all the scale of his ambition, Genghis Khan recognized greatness when he saw it. His respect for Jalal al-Din, expressed in words that later chroniclers preserved, reveals something striking. Even the most relentless conqueror could pause to honor courage. This acknowledgement was not weakness but strength, an affirmation that valor had meaning even in defeat. It was this paradox that gave the Indus its enduring resonance. The Mongols triumphed, but the vanquished was remembered not as a victim, but as a warrior whose spirit refused to be broken. For Jalal al-Din, the leap into the Indus was more than a physical escape. It was an assertion of dignity in the face of annihilation. His dynasty lay in ruins, his father disgraced by retreat and betrayal, his homeland consumed by fire and blood. Yet in that desperate charge, in the act of turning his horse against the Mongol tide and throwing himself into the river, he created a story that outlived him. His later years may have been marked by wandering, hardship, and an ignoble death at the hands of opportunistic tribesmen, but the memory of the Indus immortalized him. In history, it is often not the long reigns of kings that endure, but the moments of defiance that capture the imagination. The clash at the Indus also stands as a symbol of the larger transformations of the 13th century. It marked the point at which the Islamic world, once dominant across vast regions, faced a new kind of threat, one not bound by the old rules of warfare or politics. The Mongols brought with them not only cavalry and siege machines, but a relentless philosophy of conquest that disregarded established powers. The Abbasids, the Seljuks, the Khwarezmians, all were confronted with a force that recognized no legitimacy but its own. Jalal al-Din's struggle was thus not only personal but emblematic of the broader collision between old orders and new. And yet, the legacy of this encounter was not solely destruction. The Mongol conquests, for all their devastation, also knit together the heart of Eurasia in ways unseen before. They facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across continents. The Silk Road flourished under their protection, and new connections reshaped the medieval world. In this sense, the Indus was both an ending and a beginning, the end of Khwarezmian independence, but also a chapter in the emergence of a world system that would carry knowledge, commerce, and culture across boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable. For the Islamic world, Jalal al-Din's memory offered a thread of resilience. Centuries later, poets and chroniclers invoked his name as a model of courage. In times of crisis, his leap into the river was remembered as an act of resistance against overwhelming odds. He became a reminder that even when kingdoms fall, the spirit of defiance can endure. His story echoed in Persian poetry, in chronicles of Islamic historians, and even in the reflections of those who lived under Mongol rule. It was a lesson that heroism does not always lie in victory, but sometimes in the refusal to surrender. For the Mongols, the Indus campaign reinforced their reputation as relentless pursuers of enemies. Their ability to chase Jalal al-Din across deserts, mountains, and rivers demonstrated a level of mobility and determination that terrified their foes. No sanctuary seemed secure, no distance too great. Yet the fact that one man escaped, that one enemy refused to be extinguished, gave the Mongols an unintended gift, a legend that testified not only to their might, but to the worthiness of their adversaries. Empires thrive not only on conquest, but also on the stories that are told about them. And in Jalal al-Din, the Mongols found a figure whose bravery enhanced their own legacy of invincibility. Looking back, The battle at the Indus is striking for how much it reveals about the human dimensions of history. It is easy to view the Mongol conquests in terms of maps, armies, and empires, but within those vast movements are the lives of individuals caught in the tide. Jalal al-Din's leap into the river was not only a military maneuver but an act of will, a human response to despair that transcended its immediate context. In that moment, history became personal, a young man, cornered by the greatest conqueror of his age, choosing defiance over surrender. As the centuries passed, both Genghis Khan and Jalal al-Din became larger than life. Genghis was remembered as the founder of the largest contiguous empire in history, his name synonymous with power and conquest. Jalal, by contrast, became a symbol of resistance, remembered less for what he achieved than for what he represented. Together, their encounter at the Indus embodies the dual nature of history, the might of empire and the dignity of defiance, the overwhelming force of conquest and the stubborn resilience of those who refuse to yield. Today, standing on the banks of the Indus, it is difficult to imagine the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the cries of men fighting for survival. The river flows quietly, as it has for millennia, indifferent to the struggles that once shook its shores. Yet in that quiet, the memory lingers. The story of Jalal al-Din's leap endures not because it changed the outcome of Mongol expansion, but because it speaks to something timeless in the human spirit. Empires rise and fall, but the courage to resist, even in the face of certain defeat, is a story that never fades. Thus, the clash at the Indus in 1221 was not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a legend. It reminds us that history is not only about who conquers and who rules, but also about who dares to stand against the tide. In the shadow of Genghis Khan's empire, Jalal al-Din left a mark not of dominion, but of defiance. And in that defiance, he achieved a kind of immortality that even the greatest conqueror could not erase.